You ask? Because if you are not getting this part, I will be very unhappy with myself. Because this is one of the very, as we said before, this is something we are not going to learn. We are not going to learn it in the book. It's out of experience, and it is also very important for the rest of the design. So the general question is, what range of values should my variable or attribute take? Right? I thought about prices here. So for the time being, let's talk about price of, like in this example, is how much will you be willing to pay to enter in the Galapagos Island Natural Park? The other kind of idea that you could be thinking is, what is the range of, if you are asking people how many hours a month will you be willing to put in order to have better urban green spaces in your city? That is one that we are doing there in Umeå, where I live. That is another kind of payment. The other one that I can think on is, how many hours will you be willing to commute to take a sick person to the doctor a month? I'm trying to come up with other examples. And in general, let's talk about, for the time being, about continuous variables, right? But it also applies to categorical variables, and we are going to make a little bit of an example there. If that is the general question, let's go to the one of prices. You could say, what price should I put as the reference in my discrete choice experiment? Oh, I am thinking on one example now. We did one study where what we were interested was, are people willing to support a reforestation project in a urban place, in a urban city, that is in a semi-desertic part of Mexico? And we told them, look, if we reforestate in these spots, we all are going to have better air quality. So the question was, how much will you be willing to pay for this reforestation? Afforestation, actually, that's the right term, afforestation. I learned that with my colleagues in natural sciences. So one of them said, well, we should be asking around the price, around the value, around the cost of afforestation, right? If we know how many hectares need to be afforested in the city, and we know how many head of families, head of households are, and we assume everyone pays the same, we should have the total divided by that, and then that is what we should be asking, around that value. And I said, that is an excellent suggestion. So let's imagine for the time being that when we calculate that value, that is very much the logic behind proposing that value is that if we were going to finance the project of afforestation, and everyone or most of the people are willing to pay around what they will contribute, then we could say, okay, let's finance it, right? Let's assume for the time being that that value is, I don't know, 500. Actually, I am glad that you are asking me this question, because I want to take advantage to make some conceptual distinctions. One of those is the following. Imagine that everyone says to that value, yes, I will be willing to pay that value for afforestation. Based on the logic of how we set that value, the conclusion will be, then the government could implement the afforestation policy because everyone is willing to pay the corresponding amount if we were going to allocate it evenly. Do you follow me? Am I being? That is one answer, and that is an important one, and that has a very important public policy implication. Okay? Implicitly, what I am telling you is, if everyone says yes to that value, the afforestation program passes the cost-benefit analysis, right? It costs 100,000, and based on the benefits that I am estimating, everyone seems to benefit at least as much as it costs. Everyone is willing to pay the corresponding to cover the 100,000. So let's build it. Let's do the afforestation program. Now, tell me something, some one of you or all of you. Can I say what is the value that people assign to the program? Can I say how important is for the people this program? The answer is no. For those of you who are still thinking about it, let me give you the other example. Imagine that with the same value, I am assuming a 500. In the previous example, everyone say yes. And then I say, go ahead, government. Everyone said yes. Now imagine in another example with the same value that everyone says no. Then of course I go ahead and I say, don't do it, government. No one wants to pay. Does it mean, in the second example, that people assign value 0 to the afforestation program? No. Okay, who is going to explain me what is going on here? Thank you.
I think it's like a question we asked in contingency evaluation. So we generally ask him, the first question is that, are you willing to pay this benchmark? We set the benchmark, we ask the question, are you willing to pay or not? So if the person is saying, okay, I am willing to pay this certain amount, then the next question is, are you willing to pay 100 rupees more or 100 rupees less? So that we are trying to find out that what his consumer point of view, what is his willing to pay at that point. It's like it may change from person to person. So directly going on to like everybody should give 500 rupees will not lead me to any valuation or my contribution towards that project. So if somebody is saying no to 500, it doesn't mean that he don't want to pay. It means that he may pay 200 rupees, not 0. So we have to go to that. We have to ask the next question: are you willing to pay 100 rupees less to this or 200 rupees less to this? If he says yes to that, it means he's willing to pay 300 rupees. So there's a difference in that context.
I like the part of your explanation. If anyone wants to contribute, raise your hand. Someone else? I'm going to complement, and in the meanwhile, let's keep the microphone there in case that someone else wants to contribute. But what you said, I'm going to rephrase it in the following way. When we ask people, are you willing to pay 500? And they say no. What they are saying is, what they are revealing is that their willingness to pay, the only thing that you can conclude is that their willingness to pay is lower than 500. Right? You cannot conclude that their willingness to pay is 0. You cannot conclude that their willingness to pay, that they don't have a willingness to pay. And if they say yes to the question, are you willing to pay 500? And they say yes, you can conclude that their willingness to pay is 500 or more. So, if in my example at the very beginning, we only were asking, as my colleague who was a biologist told us, well, the only number that matters, she said, is this number, the 500, because if everyone is willing to pay 500, we can say that the program is beneficial for everyone and we can cover it with the willingness to pay. And I said, yeah, sure. I mean, that we can say, that she was right. But we cannot say what is the value that people assign, because even in the case that everyone says yes to 500, there might be many people who value the afforestation program even more than what it cost. That's what I want to take advantage of you not understanding me before. Sorry, no, actually, that was the wrong phrasing. Sorry. Me not explaining it correctly before, or not explaining it clearly before, to try to actually get into the concept of what is value, what is cost-benefit analysis, and whether the value of someone should or should not be included in the cost-benefit analysis, and whether the value that we get from discrete choice experiments and contingent valuation imply that you should be recommending to create a market or not. Okay? Okay. So let's go to the beginning. That 500, even when it could make sense that because the cost of producing something is 500 per person, is not the right range of values that you should be covering. And it's not only around that number, because again, my colleague who was a biologist and she didn't have to know, she said, well, I mean, 500, 550, and 550, she suggested, right? Minus 50 plus 50. She says, that is the important, relevant range of value if people want to pay around what it costs to do the afforestation program. And it's so funny because a biologist talks a lot about values of ecosystem services. And I told her, what you are saying implies that you think that the value of the ecosystem service is equal to the cost of providing the afforestation program. But there are multiple reasons why people might value something more than what it costs. It costs 500, but it might be that someone is willing to pay 800. And it might be that even when it costs 500, someone might not be willing to pay more than 200. So that is the logic in general that you should be thinking whenever it comes to the range of prices that you should be considering. It's not only about how much it costs to provide a service or the good that you are suggesting. If you are suggesting a new cropping technology or a new way to use water in a very efficient way, and you might know how much it costs, but you have to stretch the range of value that you ask in your survey. You have to increase the bid and you have to decrease the bid. Now the general question is, how much do I increase it? Should I increase it to a number up so high that no one say yes? The answer is no. Should I decrease it to a point where everyone say yes? The answer is no. The reason of why the answer is no is, for those of you who have taken your statistics and econometric courses, you are wasting information, or you are having redundant information. When everyone says to a value no or yes, there is nothing to explain. Everyone is deterministic. If you run a regression with those, there is no variation that you can explain. Everything is explained by the bid itself. Everything that explains that you say no to $1 million is that it is $1 million. I have no $1 million. So in order to have a variation to explain in a regression that explains that someone say yes or not, you need that it is not everyone saying yes and it is not everyone saying no. That's why the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule statistically is when you run enough binary logics, you realize that having more yes than 80% doesn't give you good standard errors in the coefficient. Having less than 20% doesn't give you good standard errors in the coefficients. That's why you should stretch it up to 20% and 80%. And I said that I also wanted to take advantage to relate this question to what is the recommendation in the end coming from these studies. Something that I want you to take in mind, and I will give you the word in a few minutes, is the following. A discrete choice experiment is a way to simulate a market and a contingent valuation as well, and right now we are talking about both. So if we are simulating a market, you truly want to convince people that the government or the entrepreneur or whomever in your scenario is involved is going to implement the policy or the change if it passes the cost-benefit analysis. If as many people as possible can pay for it, and it can cover the cost, so that actually is a good investment from the private perspective, or from the government perspective, or from the welfare perspective. That's why you want to definitely consider somewhere in your range of prices the cost of providing the service, for sure. It has to be covered. But you have to consider that people also may value even more or less than the cost. So sometimes the cost is going to be very much in the right, potentially outside the range of people saying yes, right? It could be that the cost is 800, and when you did your study, you made it up to 700, and only in 700 people were saying, 20% of the people were saying yes. That is what it is. That is the range of prices that matters for people in that respect. So do consider the cost, and try to incorporate the cost in the range of prices. But what is the range of prices in the end? Is the range of prices that matters for people, because people are the one assigning value to the service that you are providing. Remember, in many respects, we motivated the course because we want to inform public policy for climate change. And unfortunately, a lot of the times you are going to find that a lot of the policies to tackle climate change are not valued by the general audience or by the specific population, so that it passes a cost-benefit analysis. And that is going to be the conclusion. Whether that is good, whether that is bad, well, you will have a public policy implication section. Okay? Now, as much as you are going to be simulating a market, and as much as the goal of a good discrete choice experiment is to convince people that this is going to be implemented if it passes the cost-benefit analysis. Remember, what you want to obtain is an estimate of how much people value the service. That's the ultimate goal. Not always you are going to end up recommending the creation of the corresponding market. And actually, not always is really the ultimate goal. It is an artifact. The simulation of the market is an artifact so that people get convinced that they will have to pay, so that people state their values. Once they state their values, you say it passes or doesn't pass the cost-benefit analysis. I recommend or not the policy, or I recommend or not the market. But in the end, recommending the creation of a market is not the ultimate goal, but obtaining an estimate of the value for people of the service to see if the project passes a cost-benefit analysis. Yes?
My question is that you were saying that we should not go to the extent where everybody says no and where everybody says yes. Sir, but there is information there also, right? Because that is saying us the range of the price they are willing to pay. If everybody in the population started saying no, so we can conclude from that this is the amount they are on the edge. This is the range of the prices they are willing to pay.
Thank you. That's a very good point. If as part of your study, you come up with the totally yes and totally no, that is information for your design, right? When you are designing, you know that you should not be passing those values. But those are values. When I say those are don't go that way. What I mean is, do not include it in your discrete choice experiment or your contingent valuation. But if you already know which are those values, the ones that give you the zeros and the 1, then you are lucky, because you know what values not to pass. But the important thing is that it should not be included in the discrete choice experiment. You already know what is the maximum and what is the minimum. Questions? Yes.
That 500 amount in this example, we can get it from existing literature also, or conducting a preliminary survey.
Exactly.
We can get that idea. And one more thing, this willingness to pay or willingness to accept is going to be one of the attributes.
Yes. Thank you. That is a very good question that I have not addressed. By including the price, you are going to later on being able to calculate the willingness to pay. Because the willingness to pay is defined as the substitution rate between money and the other attributes.
Exactly.
So we will see in the regression, you run a regression, you obtain a coefficient for green and for money. You divide the coefficient of green by the coefficient of money, and that gives you the marginal rate of substitution between green and money, but that is a willingness to pay. That is how much you are willing to give up money for green. That's what we call in economics willingness to pay. But I started with those two examples of the greening and the parking and everything because willingness to pay is not only in terms of money. In that example, you were willing to pay with parking spaces or with facade space, because there we are also able to calculate marginal rate of substitution. So you always are going to have, I'm going to repeat what I said yesterday. A good discrete choice experiment is the one that presents you to trade-offs. So as long as one of those attributes is something that you will not happily give up, and one of those attributes is one that you really wish you had, there are trade-offs. And if there are trade-offs, you can calculate a willingness to pay in a unit that could be money, and most of the times is money because we are economists, but it could be parking spaces or facade space. How much of my facade space I am willing to give up for more green, okay? That is the requirement to be able to calculate willingness to pay. That the discrete choice experiment presents trade-offs. When you do yours, make sure that you know that at least one of the attributes provokes disutility, that people hate it, that people don't want to give up money. And one of them is something that people wish with all their heart. People want green in that neighborhood, right? So that is a trade-off. If you have that, you will be able to calculate a willingness to pay, because a willingness to pay is nothing else but a marginal rate of substitution. Okay? What do you think? Did I explain a little bit better this curve this time? Yeah? Okay. And do you understand how a good discrete choice experiment should convince people that they are in a situation, they are being consulted in a situation that very likely is going to happen? That is called policy consequentiality. That the change is going to happen if most of the people are saying yes. There is another consequentiality, payment consequentiality. There is a lot of very technical literature out there that are discussing what is exactly it is, what is not. And in this course, the only distinction I want to make is this. Policy consequentiality refers to whether people believe that if everyone or most of the people vote for the change or are willing to pay for the change is going to be considered to happen. So for instance, we have put a discrete experiment with a colleague of mine in 5 different countries in Europe, where we are telling them, please answer this discrete experiment that considers different ways of adapting to climate change, and it's going to cost you this much. We are asking you this because we were hired by the European Union government body to inform them of your preferences. And they will decide how to consider our inputs. So by the end, after the discrete choice experiment, remember I told you there is always a section where we ask questions. One important question that you need to ask is, how likely do you think that the results of this study are going to be considered by the policymakers in your country? That's what we are asking them. That's as much as we can get. Ideally, you want to push hard and say, answer truthfully, because the government, the European government body is totally going to rely on our opinion on what we say. Because we are not allowed to say that, unfortunately. We cannot get to that point, right? But ideally, that's what you want. In the case of the Galapagos, let me show you that here. Let me show you how we did it. Remember, policy consequentiality, okay? I'm going to go to the other consequentiality. We want to know how much you are willing to contribute to fund enforcement of a conservation measure in Galapagos. Because the GNDP, which is the government body, is considering to increase the fee to everyone who is older than 18. If implemented, these extra funds will exclusively finance enforcement of conservation measures. And the last 2 parts are the parts that we claim involve policy consequentiality. The GNPD, which is the agency administering the Galapagos, has full authority to revise the entrance fee, which is what we are asking you for here. And also, they have the full authority to implement the conservation measures that I am describing here, right? And it happens to be that the information collected here will be analyzed by us in the Charles Darwin Foundation, who is the scientific advisor of the GNPD. So we are the ones who tell the scientific recommendation to the body that takes the decisions both of increasing the fee and of changing the conservation measures. And they are asking us to inform them because they want to see whether you want to contribute to the preservation measures through increasing fees. That's what we call policy consequentiality. To deliver the message that what we are doing is going to end up in the desk of the people who take the decisions. Why? Because we cannot tell them truthfully that whatever we say, it will go. We should have that power, but they don't let us say that. That is policy consequentiality. And basically, it means that in this world where everything is hypothetical, in this simulated market, if you don't make them believe that there is some chance that this translates into policy, they're going to throw you any number, right? Any of us will say, yeah, sure, $5,000. Who is going to come and charge me? So that because you want to really get at the value, you need to convince them that there is a chance that this becomes a policy, and then next time that you visit Galapagos, you are going to be paying as much as we estimated. I don't know if you know, but just 3 months ago, the price in Galapagos went from 100 that they used to pay before our study, and now they are going to be paying $300 the entrance fee. I was suggesting 500, but they didn't want to listen to me. But I mean, it's always nice to see that there was an increase. So next time that they answer a survey like this, they will say, okay, I have to take it seriously. Okay, that is policy consequentiality. The other component is called payment consequentiality, and it is a little bit fuzzy, the difference. If you think about it, in this specific case, payment consequentiality and policy consequentiality is the same, because the policy in itself will mean that they will increase the fee, right? In other cases, it's less obvious, but using this as the case to differentiate policy and payment consequentiality, basically, policy consequentiality will be that the government body says, now you have to pay 300. That will be policy consequentiality. And it does not tie perfectly to payment consequentiality. If someone thinks that it doesn't matter, they can always enter from the back door into the Galapagos, right? For the specific case of the Galapagos, actually, that's not the case. They are very strict on who, when to enter. If you go through cruises and everything, the visa, everything, in Galapagos, it's very well counted who enters and who doesn't. So in that case, payment happens. If this was going to be done, for instance, in a natural park in Mexico, policy consequentiality is not the same as payment consequentiality, because there is always very bad monitoring of the park, and if they increase the price, there will be always some way to enter in this beautiful natural park from doors that no one knows. So, but that's the kind of, I like to use that as an example of payment and policy consequentiality. Okay? Sometimes the policy is not in itself the fees, but so again, you want a well-simulated market, and that involves that people believe that they will have to pay if that policy is implemented, and that their answers are going to be taken into account for that policy to be implemented. Payment consequentiality, policy consequentiality. One more term, one of those technical terms. Incentive compatibility. Incentive compatibility is related to endogeneity. You want people to be able to tell you the truth without choosing themselves, the value. So for instance, who of you tell me why is that I don't ask, instead of asking, are you willing to pay? Are you willing to pay 250? Are you willing to pay 500? Are you willing to pay 700? Why is that I don't ask directly, an open question? How much are you willing to pay? Why is that I don't ask you that? Because?
Because there is a benchmark in cost. We have
benchmark. That's one of the reasons. It could be one of the reasons, but there is one that is even more troublesome.
Because you have to incur the cost also, no? It's not necessarily like. It's not. If I ask somebody what is your willingness to pay without any benchmarking, you will not know only what's the context actually. He will say his answer based on his income levels. That will be other factors will be dependent on it. But if you take a benchmark and make him understand, okay, this is the amount we are contributing to conservation or something, and then you say the person, are you willing to pay 200 more or like 300 more? Then we can get a more accurate answer because they don't have a reference actually. That's what I think.
It is definitely one of the reasons, but the most troublesome one is tan 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 tan.
Maybe the person is not aware of what he is getting from the price he is paying. So if we say that we are trying to conserve this place and he might not be aware of the benefits, so maybe we are trying to convince him that the reward which he is getting should be incentive compatible to what he is paying. So yes, to make them understand that.
If at the moment that we are asking willingness to pay, the person still is not too aware what she or he is getting, then we are doing a bad job. We have to be very good at the very beginning to establish what we are selling. Remember, we are simulating a market. We are going to have a scenario. We are going to be, so the government is considering this, and you will get this, and you will get that. Are you willing to pay this much? So at that moment, we are doing a bad job if the person doesn't understand.
Maybe I feel like here the value for money is very
Personal thing, it might be like a household income plus priority question. So if you ask every household, they'll have different responsibilities, things that they're going to prioritize over this, and the cost that they will assign to it will also really differ then. I don't know what the economic term for something would be, but I think that's the phenomena here.
No, and actually it is true. It is good that it varies, and it is good that everyone has their own value. But here is the problem. When I'm sure that you have gone to the market.
Pay will be very underestimated, right? No one will tell how much we are willing to pay.
That's the reason.
If someone asks me how much I'm willing to pay.
Here is the thing. You go to the market. That's the reason, right? Underestimation. And so think when you go to the market, and I forget how you call it in English, but in Mexico we call it regateo. You go to the informal market and you say to the guy, how much is that pants? He's not going to tell you how much do you want to pay me for that pants, because how much are you want to pay for that pants? Whatever number you are willing to pay minus 100, 300, 500. When people are open, ask how much are you willing to pay, people are going to underestimate. We like to underestimate our willingness to pay as much as we like to overestimate our willingness to be compensated for something. So that's why we don't ask openly, because that question is not incentive compatible. You don't have the incentive to say the truth. Okay? Do not confuse policy consequentiality, payment consequentiality, and incentive compatibility. The incentive compatibility refers to whether you are in the conditions to reveal your willingness to pay from the question. That's why we came out asking people, are you willing to pay 50? Are you willing to pay 70? Are you willing to pay 100? It's called binary dichotomous choice question. Because the only option that you have in that moment is to say yes or no. You are not coming out with your own number. Sorry. You are not coming out with your own number. You are not deciding what to pay. You have the incentives to tell the truth, whether you are willing to pay that number or not. What do we lose? What I said before. The only thing that you can conclude is that the willingness to pay of people is higher, equal or higher, in the case that they say yes to 50, or lower than 50 if they say no. That's why someone came out here with what is called double dichotomous choice, which is once you say yes to that number, I ask you, are you willing to pay? And then I ask you for a higher number. So now I know that if you say yes, no, you are willing to pay more than 50, and if you say no to 70, and that you are willing to pay less than 70. So I am decreasing the range of potential values where your willingness to pay falls, and therefore I am gaining more information. Otherwise, I lose too much information by asking just one number. That is part of the contingent valuation study. If you think about it in a discrete choice experiment, implicitly, we are doing a double dichotomous choice question when we ask this. Because basically we are telling them, are you willing to pay something between 35 and 350? In this case, it's not completely perfectly clear. But when these two or that one is the same value of the attribute, that only you change this, more or less that's what it means. Strictly speaking, at some point they will be facing one where both of them are the same, but the price, and then implicitly what you are asking is, are you willing to pay 30 or 350 if I present you to this? But then yesterday I explained you how actually we are eliminating those alternatives from this, because when you are presented to the same option but you can pay less, you are going to choose the one where you pay less, right? So strictly speaking, we could present it, but we don't present it in this scenarios because they are dominated. But implicitly we are doing a double dichotomous choice question, like the contingent evaluation. Okay. What else it has to do with design? Policy consequentiality, incentive compatibility, and policy and payment consequentiality. Okay, those are the questions that come after the survey, after the discrete choice experiment. I told you the one about how likely do you think that your opinion is going to be considered by the European Union government when taking this decision? That is for you to evaluate whether people think that there is policy consequentiality. And then the other one is, how likely do you think that this translates into an increase in taxes? That is to measure whether they think that there will be payment consequentiality. And people could believe that they will pull the policy without really increasing the taxes, for instance. So it's worth asking those two questions afterwards. The other questions that come after your discrete choice experiment relate to the attributes. If you think that there is one attribute that in particular is problematic, you could kind of test your respondent after that. For instance, I could always ask, how did you interpret the distance or time to your shared office? And then I can put alternatives where, two alternatives are the correct interpretation, or only one is the correct interpretation, and three are the incorrect interpretation. So if it turns out that they choose the incorrect interpretation, we will realize that they didn't understand us. And then you can say, I probably should drop this person, or I could do something else. But it's important that you understand, that you realize whether they are understanding your choice set, your attributes. And the other two questions that come after is importance. Which one of the attributes was the most important for you? And which one of the attributes was the least important to you? Because in that way, you double check that you are including important attributes for most of the people. If 90% of the people tells you that the bike parking was not important, then you did something wrong. But if, for some people something is not going to be important, for some people. So usually, to tell you the truth, in my experience, the one that comes as most important is the price, which is not surprising. And when it comes to the least important, actually, you need to have some variation. You want all of the attributes to be the least important you want all the attributes to, a proportion of the people to say that one of the attributes is not as important, because they are not going to be equally important for everyone. And that's good. So those are the questions that come after the discrete choice experiment. 13 minutes to 5:30, so questions? Yes?
Somebody will take it. Kajal. You need to.
Yeah.
Your energy, please conserve.
Yeah. I am going to, yeah.
I
should probably have asked this question a bit earlier on, but I am having some difficulty understanding how we are estimating. So we have given these choice sets, right? And choice sets have alternatives to all of our respondents, right? So what we'll end up estimating with the logic will probably be like the probability of choosing an alternative I from a choice set, from like a particular choice set. But we are trying to isolate the impact of particular attributes, right? We are trying to give values to particular attributes. So how are we isolating that from the equation? I'm not understanding what the like y and what the x's are and how that plays into like the betas that we are estimating, or like the odds ratio or whatever, the marginal effects, whatever they are for particular attributes. How are we reaching to that?
I am going to be explaining with detail that tomorrow, and also actually tomorrow is going to be Charu. So yeah, for the sake of that, what I can answer right now is that have you run OLS? Okay, so imagine that you run an OLS where the dependent variable in this case is 0, 1. Yeah? It's not continuous, it's just 0, 1, which actually is possible. It's called probability linear model.
Most of us have run logics as well.
Okay. If you have a logit and you have a 0, 1, and then basically you explain that someone answers 1 based on the values of the attributes. So the explanatory variables are the attributes themselves. So for instance, imagine that this price, one of the attributes, the more the price increases, the less likely you choose that alternative with the higher price. Or the more distance you have to travel to your office, the less likely you choose it. So because these are attributes that are orthogonally designed, the coefficients associated with that change in probability, those are the ones that are going to give you a good idea of marginal effects. Now in the linear in the logits, the coefficients are not themselves marginal effects. Instead, we use them to calculate the marginal rate of substitution by dividing the coefficient of one by the one of the price. But if this was a linear probability model or no less, you could interpret the coefficients as marginal effects.
So we end up getting those for particular attributes. So over here, the probability of choosing a particular alternative in a particular choice set also depends on like what are the alternatives available, right? So
yeah, exactly. That is part of the assumption. The assumption is that that you are going to give me a second. The model says you are going to choose from the available alternatives the one that gives you the most utility. So in that respect, is that depends on what is available in the choice set. But the important thing is that it does not depend on what is available in other choice sets. If it was somehow people was remembering, oh, but in 3 choice sets before this was available, and that enters in their decision, then definitely we are in problems. So when we present them, we ask them to choose from among the alternatives that are in the choice set. Because that is okay, that is because you are going to compare the utility that you get with one versus the other, and that's what you choose. So in that respect is that you are right. It depends on what is available, but only in the choice set.
I think probably they won't see pattern.
The regressions, right?
No, even before regression, the randomization model. Utility, so 3 alternatives, utility from each, and when you're choosing one, that means that difference in utility.
Yeah.
That kind of.
They
haven't seen it before.
Yeah. Let me bring it. Yeah. When we take another question, and then I in the meanwhile I upload.
Yes, sir. Here is online question from Tubin from Nepal. Actually, he's asking question that I was attempting to review and study the impact of climate change to the migration from Hindu Kush Himalayan region, and was suffered by lack of proper previously done cross-sectional studies. I think applying DCE with climate stressor as attribute could be impactful? If there are any previous literature, please mention or suggest.
Let me see if I understood that. Is a discrete choice experiment in the context of climate change adaptation?
Yeah, so let us repeat the question.
So it's from Himalayas, migration takes place in that context. Right?
Yeah, yes.
Due to climate change, migration is taking place from Himalayas.
That one is that takes me to one case that we are trying to do in Mexico right now. I don't think that there are discrete choice experiments in the context of migration of people. But I should not be lying to you. My student is doing the literature review as we speak, so I'm meeting him tomorrow, so probably on Thursday I will tell you for real. But the way we want to do it in Mexico is we want to go to a community where people are, where youngsters consider migration with relative frequency, like due to climate change, but also due to almost cultural reasons, because in Mexico we have a lot of communities that have been migrating several decades already. Some of the males consider it almost as a, how do you call it, as a ceremony of passage. How do you say, like becoming older? So the discrete choice experiment that we try to put there, that we are just starting to do right now, says we'll try to measure how much will a teenager between 17 and 19, 20 will want to make in their future job in their state to not migrate to USA. You see what I'm going? Like we are going to be presenting types of contracts of jobs that are going to include expected payment, social security that only comes with formal sector or not, with formal sector, and also the sector. Do you want to work in the agricultural sector still? Do you want to work in the office, in an office? Do you want to work in the industry? And see with that how much is the average teenager expecting to make in exchange to not migrate. And one of the attributes is going to be how many more years do they want to study, or are they willing to study, if they are going to want to make that amount of money. But to the best of my knowledge, there is no discrete choice experiment trying to address migration. So there is definitely a research gap there, and it will be really interesting to address it.
You got it, right? You got it. Yeah.
Yeah.